Welcome back. In this explainer, we're digging into some really practical, hands-on lessons from the European NFAE project. We're going to explore their guide on a super important topic: how to turn the challenges of a diverse classroom into a real strength for every single learner. So the guide really kicks things off with the big question, right? The one every educator has to grapple with. How do we build a space where every learner, no matter where they come from or what their story is, feels like they truly belong and can succeed? Let's see what the project partners found out. First things first, the NFAE project made one thing absolutely crystal clear. As all the different pilot organizations were working to get their courses aligned with European standards, they hit on something essential. These courses didn't just need to look good on paper. They had to be genuinely inclusive in practice. This was never about paperwork. It was always about people. And that led them to this core insight, which is so powerful. Inclusion isn't some nice-to-have feature or an add-on you sprinkle in at the end. Nope. It's the very foundation everything else is built on. Without it, you just can't get real learning, you can't get genuine participation, and you for sure can't build the trust learners need to make progress. Okay, so if inclusion is our foundation, what's the first major hurdle we usually face? Language, of course. When you have learners with all different levels of proficiency in the language you're teaching in, you've got to tackle that head on. So the guide lays out 4 really practical field-tested strategies. The goal here isn't to overwhelm anyone, but to create a bunch of different ways to understand what's going on. We're talking lots of visuals and gestures, getting learners to help each other out, really zeroing in on just the most essential vocabulary, and, when you can, bringing in translators or mediators. And here's a perfect example of this in action. For learners with low literacy, a page full of text is, well, it's just a huge barrier. The Spanish pilot found that using simple pictures, diagrams, and even just hand gestures weren't just helpful, they were absolutely essential to getting the message across. And the team in Italy added 2 more really powerful techniques to the mix. First, for certain activities, they grouped learners with similar language skills together, which just made it easier for them to communicate. Second, having cultural or language mediators in the room who spoke key languages made a massive, massive difference in making sure everyone could actually participate. Now let's talk about something a little more subtle, but just as important: the actual culture of the classroom. How do you get people to participate when they might have completely different ideas about what participation even looks like? You know, we all carry these hidden ideas about what a classroom should be like. For some learners, it's a formal place where the teacher talks and you listen quietly. That's how you show respect. But for others, a classroom is all about interaction, and speaking up is how you show you're engaged. It's so crucial to remember that a quiet student isn't necessarily an uninterested one. So how do you bridge that gap? The guide gives 3 really clear steps. First, don't assume everyone knows the rules. Explicitly explain how things like group discussions are going to work. Second, start small. And third, create different ways for people to contribute. Not everyone has to be the one talking the most. It's all about making it comfortable for everyone to share in their own way. Let's just double-click on that second point for a second. Think about it. A big whole class discussion can be incredibly intimidating, especially if you're not confident in your language skills or you're unsure of the cultural norms. But a small group, just 2 or 3 other people, that feels so much safer. It's the perfect place to test out an idea, build some confidence, and find your voice. This brings us to what might just be the most important lesson from the entire project. Seriously, across every single pilot, in every country, the partners all identified one single factor that stood above everything else when it came to success. And this was it. It wasn't the curriculum, it wasn't the teaching materials, it was the atmosphere. Creating a space where people feel safe to just be themselves, to make mistakes, and to learn without ever feeling judged, that, right there, is where the magic happens. So what does an inclusive learning environment actually mean in practice? Well, it's about actively, intentionally creating a space that lowers the barriers, whether that's language or low literacy, or even things like childcare responsibilities, all to support everyone's participation and boost their confidence. And how do you build that? Sometimes it's with something as wonderfully simple and human as a tea break. The Italian partner found that just setting aside some informal social time with tea and snacks was incredibly powerful. It breaks down those formal walls and helps build real community, trust, and genuine connection between cultures. Right. An inclusive classroom also means recognizing that learning doesn't happen in a bubble.
It has to be flexible enough to adapt to the complex and often really challenging realities of our learners' actual lives.
So many learners, especially those in vulnerable situations, are just juggling a ton of pressure. They might be dealing with unstable housing, taking care of family, or coping with a lot of emotional stress. Showing up irregularly often isn't a choice. And that digital divide, it is very, very real. All of these things directly affect their ability to show up and engage. The Spanish pilot gave us a perfect example of this disconnect. The course plan had 40 hours of independent work baked in. That plan assumed learners had internet at home and a quiet place to study. But the reality for them, independent work outside the center was pretty much impossible. So the crucial advice that came back from the field is this: be realistic. Before you assign any work to be done outside the classroom, do a quick, informal resource assessment. Do your learners actually have what they need to get it done? If the answer is no, then the work has to be adjusted so it can be completed with your support, right there at the center. Okay, let's pull all these threads together. The big message from the NFAE project isn't that you should be overwhelmed by these challenges, it's that you should feel empowered by these strategies to meet them head on. And the guide is so clear on this point. This quote is worth remembering. You are the expert. All these tools and strategies are here to support your professional judgment and your experience, not to replace it. At the end of the day, you know your learners best. And that's really the ultimate takeaway, isn't it? Diversity isn't just something to be managed, it's an asset. When you use intentional, thoughtful strategies for inclusion, that rich mix of languages, cultures, and life experiences in your room can become the single greatest strength of your entire learning environment.
Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer. In our next episode, we're going to keep digging into these lessons from the field, and we'll be focusing on how the pilots tackled the super important topics of assessment and certification. We'll see you then.